Okay, great. We will go ahead and get started. So I'm Jeff Wheeler. You may know me from the other panels. On this session, we have the LERA best papers dealing with gig work in multiple contexts. And we see the intersection between non-standard work, standard work, digital platforms, and also the provision of healthcare. So I think we have a very interesting group of papers, and we're going to dive in with the first paper, which is by Kang of Marquette University on the impact of growth in non-standard workforce on standard employees' attitudes and firm performance. Sam is assistant professor at Marquette and received his PhD from the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. And so why don't you go ahead and I'll do brief introductions for the others when we get to their papers.
Okay, sure. Thank you. So I will here. Can you see this, my slide?
Yes, we can see them.
Okay, good. So, okay, thank you. So the title of this session is Gig Work in Multiple Contexts. So when you think of gig workers, we tend to focus on new tech companies like Uber that heavily rely on gig workers. But I think we should not underestimate the phenomena that the companies, more and more companies hire non-standard workers and gig workers and use both standard workers and non-standard workers at the same time. So it would be, in that sense, it would be an interesting research question that is, what are the effects of increasing use of non-standard workers on standard employees' job attitudes and ultimately organizational outcomes at the organizational level. So basically, the research question of this study is this one. And maybe this is not a new, very new research question. Actually, many scholars investigated the different effects of the use of non-standard workforce on different kinds of organizational outcomes. And some found that there are negative overall effects of the use of non-standard workers. But at the same time, there are some studies that found positive overall effects of the use of non-standard workforce. So basically, the research are mixed. So that's why we dig into this research question again. And actually, we suggest that there are some important research gap in this line of research. The first one is that depending on the researchers' disciplinary backgrounds, the prior research use different kinds of outcomes. So, for example, psychologists tend to focus on the effects of the use of non-standard workers on employees' attitudes, and some others focus more on the firm's financial performance and etc. So, in this study, we use both job satisfaction and firm performance in a single study to better understand the big picture of the relationship between the effects of the using non-standard workers on different types of organizational outcomes. And second limitation we think important is that prior research tend to hold the static view and use the number of non-standard workers or the proportion of non-standard workers in an organization as independent variable. But we think that this is problematic and we adopt a more dynamic view. Let's take an example. Let's say that there are two companies that hire exactly the same number of non-standard workers. Organization A and organization B both hire 300 non-standard workers. And prior studies consider these two companies basically the same. But what if organization A number of non-standard workers has been increased from 100 to 300, and organizations B's number of non-standard workers has been decreased from 500 to 300, for example. Although they hire exactly the same number, they have the exactly the same number of non-standard workers, employees in the organization may perceive the situation totally differently. So that's what we want to do in this study. So we will use the growth rate of the non-standard workers as our independent variable. And third, we will consider the situational context in examining the effects of the use of non-standard workers. So basically we suggest that whether standard employees are valued in their organization or not is a very, very important situational context. So we will seek the moderate effects of standard employee acquisition and development. So basically this is our overall research model. So the independent variable is growth rate of non-standard workforce, so that we, because we hold the dynamic view. And then we think that standard employees acquisition and development will moderate the relationship between the use of non-standard workforce and standard employees' collective job satisfaction. And ultimately, we'll see if this standard employees' collective job satisfaction mediate this relationship between the use of non-standard workforce and financial performance outcomes. Okay, so basically, there are two main reasons of why organizations use non-standard workers. The first main reason is cost savings, because typically organizations do not provide extensive training or benefits to their non-standard workers, and usually their pay level is lower compared to full-time workers. And also organizations can ultimately replace standard employees with inexpensive non-standard workforce. That's one reason. And another main reason of using non-standard workers is for flexibility, because from the organization's perspective can easily terminate their employment relationship with non-standard workers when they become unnecessary. So these are two main reasons of why organizations use non-standard.
As the standard employees in the organizations will perceive.
I'm sorry, Sam, we have an audio problem. Your voice is a bit muffled.
Okay, can you?
There you go. Now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So then how standard employees will perceive when their organization use more and more non-standard workers. So that's the question. So I will speed up a little bit. So I will skip this theory part. But basically, let's take an example. In an organization, the number of non-standard workers was increased. Okay, and at the same time, the number of standard workers was decreased. In this situation, standard workers are likely to perceive that their organization use non-standard workers to save money. And standard workers are likely to believe that they can be replaced to the inexpensive non-standard workers. And also it may signal that the organization does not committed to the long-term relationship with their employees anymore. And it is also likely that standard workers have to train new non-standard workers and supervise them, because the number of standard workers decreased while the number of non-standard workers was increased. So their overall satisfaction, job satisfaction, can be decreased in this situation. Now, it's a different scenario, okay? The number of non-standard workers is increased, but at the same time, the number of standard workers is also increased. In this case, standard workers are less likely to believe that they will be replaced. Maybe it's just because the organization is growing and the organization hire both standard and non-standard workers. And actually this can benefit the standard workers because it provides job security to the standard employees, because because organizations are likely to fire non-standard workers first before they fire standard workers. So in this situation, they are less likely to believe that they will be replaced, or the organization is not committed to the employees anymore, and etc. And also, standard workers can focus on their strategically important tasks, and they can have some minor tasks to non-standard workers to do. So, and basically the similar logic can be applied to the standard employee development. So for example, if the organization invest a lot on standard employees training, while the number of non-standard employees increases, they are less likely to think that the organization use non-standard workers to save money. So so hypothesis one suggests that an organization's standard employee acquisition moderate the relationship between the growth rate of non-standard workforce and collective job satisfaction of standard employees. So if the number of standard employees increases, the growth rate of non-standard workforce will be positively impact standard employees' collective job satisfaction. But if the number of standard employees decreases, the increase in the number of non-standard workforce will be negatively affect standard employees' job satisfaction. So similarly, hypothesis two suggests that investment in development of standard employees moderate the relationship between the growth rate of the non-standard workforce and collective job satisfaction of standard employees. I expect basically the same pattern. And then hypothesis three tests whether the interaction effects between the non-standard workforce and standard employee acquisition will be mediated by standard employees' collective job satisfaction, and whether it will ultimately affect labor productivity and ROA. So hypothesis three states that the indirect relationship between the growth rate of non-standard workforce and labor productivity and ROA through collective job satisfaction is moderated by standard employees' acquisition rate. And hypothesis four is basically the same with the different moderator. So this is the overall research model. So to test this research model, we used human capital corporate panel, which is nationally representative panel data. This is great data because it's a panel data conducted in 2005, 2007, 2009, 11, 13, and 15. So, and it's also approved by the Korean National Statistical Office. So it's Korean data, but it's national representative data. So after excluding missing values, we used more than 700 observations, right? So we measured the growth rate of non-standard workforce as the percentage of changes in the number of non-standard workers, and acquisition rate of standard workforce was measured similarly, the percentage of the changes in the number of standard workers. Investment in development of standard employees was measured by log of average amount of investment in training and development programs. Job satisfaction was measured by employees using 4-item scales, and it was aggregated to the organizational level. And then organizational performance was measured with 2 variables, labor productivity and ROA. And we used a number of control variables as well.
It's good if you can jump to your conclusions. We're
Sure.
running tight on time.
Yeah, thank you. So as you can see in this table, the interaction was positive. So hypothesis 1 was supported. And this is the simple plot. Okay. So the results were basically the same with our expectations. And then this is the hypothesis 2. Okay, so it was positive and statistically significant. So this is the simple plot for the interaction effect. And then collective job satisfaction was positively and significantly related to productivity and financial performance. So based on these coefficients, we estimated the indirect effects of the increase in the use of non-standard workforce on productivity through collective job satisfaction under different conditions. And it basically supported hypothesis 3 and hypothesis 4. So this is the overall research. Okay.
Great, thank you very much. So please, if you have questions, hold them till the end. And we'll go through all the presentations and then have some time for that.
Thank you. So can I add one final comment?
Fire away.
So although many organizations use contingent workers and non-standard workers, expecting that will benefit the organization because it provides flexibility and it enables the organizations to save money. But actually, based on our research, non-standard workers can bring different standard employee reactions and firm performance. So organizations should be careful about using non-standard workers because it can have different effects under different situations. Thank you.
Great, thank you. So next we'll turn to Ben Glasner, who's a PhD candidate at the Evans School at the University of Washington. And his paper is on the Affordable Care Act, self-employment, and the gig economy.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I can go ahead and jump right in. As you probably noticed from the title slide, the title has changed a little bit. It's focusing mostly on Medicaid's expansion and its effect on self-employment, independent contract, and the online gig economy. Broadly, what I'm going to be looking at is the way in which we see Medicaid expand in its access and availability to people above the poverty line. Does that impact people's take-up of self-employment? And in particular, we're going to kind of look at the differing mechanisms between that, whether we see people take up or actually drop off. Broadly, what we want to also combine with this is that the expansion happened in 2014, and we also saw a significant increase in the availability of online gig work via platform economies, and that expansion in urban areas, and the ways these things might have interacted. The theoretical background is focused primarily on the availability of this public insurance or this public form of health insurance in comparison to ESI or employer-supplied insurance. And the two mechanisms that we really want to be focused on are job lock and employment lock. Job lock here is the transition between work arrangements to do newly available or due to newly available health insurance. So I might change which type of work I am doing based on my access to health insurance. If I was working as an employee beforehand and suddenly I get access to health insurance as a self-employed individual or in an environment where that health insurance previously wasn't available, maybe now I transition and that availability of health insurance allowed me to do that transition at work. Employment lock, on the other hand, is the transition out of the labor market due to the availability of non-employer-linked health care. So perhaps I'm working solely to be able to afford health insurance or get access to it. And once I have access to this health insurance, which isn't linked to employment, I then leave. These are the two primarily identified mechanisms in the literature that I kind of want to pin against each other and see what's the dominant effect if either actually becomes apparent in the literature or in the results. The research question then really becomes, did the expansion of Medicaid following the Affordable Care Act result in an increase or decrease in work which does not offer employer-supplied health insurance? And was the effect significantly different between types of work arrangements, including independent contracting, self-employment, and in that independent contracting area, we want to break that out into online gig work. What I end up doing to test this is I use non-employer statistics, which collect annual data on non-employer establishments and report the count of those establishments by geographic level and industry. These establishments are generally unincorporated self-employed individuals, and we want to think about them as just one person working a job that they're choosing to make. This could be your traditional self-employed version. I'm running my own independent contracting firm, doing tiling or construction. Or we want to also see that independent contractors, like gig employees, also fall into this bundle. This data set differs from things like the ACS or CWS or CPS, which focus on primary sources of income. The non-employer statistics is going to include both primary and secondary or tertiary substitute sources of income, which allows to capture people who might be doing this work as kind of a support mechanism. I use a balanced panel of counties from 2000 to 2017. I also include Uber deployment data at the county year level. So I've collected data on where and when Uber began operating within the United States, and I'm going to use that information to add as kind of an indicator for online gig work. What we're looking at then is kind of this map where we can see in counties that are green or purple, Medicaid is active in 2017, and counties that are purple are active and have Uber. Red counties are counties that have Uber but no Medicaid available, and gray counties are ones that do not have Medicaid expansion available and no Uber. So we have a lot of variation across the United States in using these two factors, and we want to kind of pit this variation against each other in a difference in difference analysis. So I'm going to define an extensive marginal effect by measuring the number of establishments per person in a county. Again, the data is at the county level and it's aggregated, so I can't do individual level data. So we're going to do an extensive marginal effect by looking at what's the likelihood someone might be taking up this work and how that likelihood of taking up the work changes over time, and in relation to our primary treatment of Medicaid's expansion, which is at county I in year T. And I'm allowing for 3 lagged effects to kind of get a sense across the whole data if maybe we end up seeing a delayed response to Medicaid's expansion in work. I'm going to include 1, 2, and 3-year lagged effects, as well as county fixed effects and year fixed effects when I'm doing a two-way fixed effect model. But I'm not just going to stop at the two-way fixed effect. I'm also going to explore interacted fixed effect models to account for some year-time interactions, as well as EM algorithmic synthetic control models and matrix completion methods. In addition to all of this, I want to kind of get a sense on what's the size of the impact. Since this is an extensive marginal effect on the likelihood of taking up the work, I want to get an ability to kind of get a sense on how big of an effect this is on the whole market. So about 14 million additional people received Medicaid resulting from the expansion in 2014. Using some measures on the likelihood of any individual person in the labor market to participate in some form, whether primary or secondary sources of income and non-standard work, I estimate that about 1.8 million of these 14 million people would have been expected to be participating in some form of self-employment. So we're going to use that 1.8 to kind of baseline these effect sizes. When we look at the actual trends, we immediately see a problem with the two-way fixed effect in that we can see the higher line towards the end are counties that do not see Medicaid expand, and the lower one is where Medicaid expansion does occur. So we have a parallel trends violation. This is what's motivating those additional models beyond the two-way fixed effect, but we do see a general increase over time. Once I actually run these methods, the two-way fixed effect being the first kind of baseline where we're worried about parallel trends violations, I see a potential impact of about 650,000 fewer people are working in self-employed than we expect, given the Medicaid expansion treatment effect, as well as those 3-year lags. When we started doing some methods to account for parallel trends violation, we do see that effect size get cut down. For the interacted fixed effects, an estimate of about 300,000. When we use our synthetic control algorithm, we see 466,000. And for our matrix completion method, we see something more similar to our two-way fixed effect model. This is kind of expected because the matrix completion method doesn't really do as good of a job of accounting for those parallel trends violations. When we think about what that looks like, though, well, that initially jumps out as an employment lock story where people might be leaving the labor market. When we look at the actual trends, the blue dashed line is our control group and the black line is the treated group. We see it's not so much the people left the labor market as much as people didn't take up additional work in these following years. So rather than people getting access to Medicaid and leaving their current jobs, once they had availability of this health insurance, they decided not to take up additional forms of work. What this falls into is some literature debating why the CPS has shown that independent contracting has remained relatively steady, but administrative data sets have shown increases in engagement in this. What I believe we're looking at is fewer people taking up this type of work as a support form of income. Since people have availability of this publicly available health insurance through Medicaid expansion, they aren't induced to take up secondary or tertiary sources of income via self-employment. The actual effect sizes of this, we can see here in comparing the EM algorithm and the matrix completion method, are significant throughout that post period with good matching in the pre-period, implying that we've accounted for some of that parallel trends violation. Once we actually look at the Uber effect with Medicaid, we end up seeing a little bit of the job lock story, where we end up seeing people are induced to take up more work in areas where Uber is available, and that work looks to be happening somewhat as a job lock effect, where people are more likely to take up some kind of support or primary sources of income when they have health insurance. And Uber being an indicator not just for Uber, but also other forms of platforms. As I've found in previous work, Uber, as I've defined it, also matches with other types of gig work in their expansions throughout the US. The overall summary is that Medicaid expansion resulted in a significant decline in engagement in self-employment, and we found that about 500,000 fewer individuals reported earnings through non-employer establishments among expansion states. Fewer people were taking up this work as opposed to leaving jobs they already had, and preliminary results shows that this is probably fewer people taking up secondary sources of income rather than choosing not to take up a primary source of income. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you for staying tight on the time. And again, we'll hold the questions, and we'll turn to Wang, who's at the Renmin University of China. She is a doctoral candidate in the School of Labor and Employment Resources at Renmin University, and was a visiting student at the MIT Institute of Work and Employment Research back in 2018 and 2019. And her paper is The Dynamic Evolution of Platform Work, a Practice-Based Solution, where she looked at rideshare in 4 different cities in China, and joins us now for her presentation from China, where it is about 3:30 in the morning. So welcome.
Thank you. Oh, let me share. Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. Thank you, Jeff, for your introduction. I'm honored to have the chance to share my research with you on this special occasion. The title of my paper is The Dynamic Evolution of Platform Work, a Practice-Based Approach. As you know, working on gig work platform has been a significant phenomenon in most of the countries in the world, and it has been a major source of increased employment both in China, US, and other countries. With change in the form of organization, contract arrangement, workplace, and the way working orders were given, gig work platforms' impact on working conditions has been controversial. Some scholars hold a relatively optimistic view, while others view as a typical case for precarious work. We have noticed the fact that the platform work turns out to be quite different in multiple contexts, like the title of our session says, and they are constantly changing with related to business strategies, labor management strategies, etc. All of this have shown that platform work was deeply embedded in social relations. So my major concern is what are the working conditions on the platform work? And most importantly, how are they formed? My general research focuses on two parts. Firstly, the social structuration of platform economy and platform work. I want to investigate how platform work was structured instead of taking it as have some certain features as given. I want to investigate how are they structured under certain political and institutional context, and how it turned out to be quite various pictures. Secondly, the role workers play in the structuration process. I contend that instead of seeing power as a property of one actor or several actors, we should investigate the power relationship from the actual interaction process between actors. I think by answering these two questions, more knowledge about the nature of this work will be gained. I will skip the literature part as the time is limited. Here is my theoretical framework. I use a practice-based approach with which I examine how practice are enacted through the process of fine-tuning of a new digital innovation and how this may reconfigure working relations. This suggests a way of taking actual practice as a starting point and delving into the reason it happens and what result has been made as a consequence. This is, I use Giden's social structuration theory as a framework for my story. This is a qualitative research. I did fieldwork on red-hailing platform, which is one of the biggest red-hailing platform in China in 4 typical cities. And the fieldwork was made from the year 2016 to 2017. My interviewees include both the ride-hailing drivers and taxi drivers. We also interviewed the line managers of the platform firm to know their intentions after certain rules, work-related rules, and what result it turned out to be. Also interviewed the representative of local car rental companies. A few more words about the car rental firm. I noticed this from my interview with the drivers, and that firms play multiple roles across different periods, from recruiting drivers and doing car rental business at the initial to driver management later on. Oh, additional data resources are like some WeChat official account articles. You can understand it as self-media. I also joined drivers' WeChat group, their self-organized group, and collect their track records. This table shows my finding briefly. It is hard to tell this story in a short time like this, but I will try. The evolution process was divided into 4 phases according to institutional shocks. The general background is high demand ride-hailing services in urban area, terrible traffic congestion, especially in busy hours, inefficient taxi industry, long existed informal economy, and people who doing informal work, which induce the meritocratic achievement ideology, which means that I can be my boss. I am responsible for myself in local culture among workers. When P-platform entered this market, the sharing economy it promoted was applauded by most of the citizens and many people who own a car because they can make supplemented income by driving part-time. The platform firm provide high bonus to them to attract users. Workers usually multi-homely settled to make more orders. Generally, they work independently on P-platform. And in the second phase, when P-platform has merged its biggest competitors in mainland China, due to the pressure from the venture capital to make a profit, it makes two adjustments. One is to lower down the average bonus. Second is to put more emphasis on service quality by initializing service score and link it to order assignment system. Many part-time drivers leave the platform due to decreased bonus and working time arrangements acquired in the service score regulation system. In the service score system. Since service score influence workers' income, but platform didn't show how it was exactly calculated, and the service customer service they provided is robotic. So the drivers began to form self-organized groups like the WeChat group to work it out and like to game the algorithm, the service score to reach a high score. Since in the third phase, since the worker cohort is so big and it has been a threat to taxi industry and public transportation system, and taxi drivers who were left behind in this transition has been a potential social problem awared by the local government. And a regulation was given by both the central government and the local government, which implies that the ride hailing is a work instead of sharing economy, instead of gig. So cities should treat it as an upgraded version of taxi. And this has brought lots of uncertainties on drivers' legal status by that kind of regulation. And it also has been a large threat to platforms' labor supply because some regulations, city level regulations are pretty strict, and like in Beijing and Shanghai, only people who got a local hukou, which is pretty hard, very hard to get, can work on the platform. So in order to maintain the driver supply and meet the society recognition of this work, the platform firm began to initiate subcontractors and set expressway for drivers connected with them to maintain labor supply. The expressway is that the platform firm promise that they can be reimbursed if they were fined by the local pubs. But drivers had to connect to the firm on their own. But if they were connected to the local subcontractors, they will help them to connect to the platform and get reimbursed. And drivers who are more economically dependent on the platform love to virtually connect it to local contractors to reduce uncertainty on their legal status. And when this kind of arrangements turn out to be effective to how the workers work on the platform and work longer, the platform set up initiate more tendentious rule for drivers connected with local subcontractors. No, sorry. The platform initiated more tendentious rule for drivers connected with local subcontractors. to maintain qualified labor supply, and more HR practice such as training, team development, career development arrangement can be found in daily interaction between car rental firms and drivers. Because at that time, the platform firm has shared part of its profit with the local car rental firms. Thus, we can see that the workers were managed with a quasi-formal organizational context, and almost all of them are full-time workers and treat this job as an occupation instead of gigs. I will make some discussions, but I'm afraid it's quite preliminary. The first is the social structuration of platform work and platform economy. As we can see, applying HR practice to manage gig workers seem to be high cost and not fit with platform's role as a matchmaker. But why does it happen? I think we should not view the platform firm as born with certain nature or properties, but focus on how the social understanding and recognition towards it has changed. And on the other side, the platform also actively shape its image in society by discursive practice. For example, it tried to make it as an icon for sharing, environment friendly at the beginning. When the platform is filled with workers who economically dependent on the platform work, and when society therefore renew their understanding on ride-hailing work as a job instead of sharing, the platform then adjusts its discourse as to provide high-quality ride-hailing service and set up tendentious role to promote good services. And when the social understanding of the ride-hailing renewed further as the upgraded version of taxi and set up relevant policies and regulations, the platform firm changed their aim to provide decent jobs for workers and help to build their professional identity by delegating driver management function to local subcontractors.
Great, thank you. It's good if you can wrap it up. We'll need to move on to the final paper.
Oh, okay. The second is the role worker play in the structuration process. The finding is the evolution process from gig work to professional work is realized by the alignment between platform firm and drivers who are most economically dependent on platform work. We do see the improvement of working conditions of full-time workers, but this was not achieved by their own active effort, but by taking advantage of the flexibility of the entire workforce. I know I was out of time, so I will make the last slide speak for itself. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. For me, it raises a question of what do you do when an algorithm is your boss? And I know from my time in China that it can be very difficult to hail a taxi, so I can understand the demand and see the complexity. Great, so we're going to move on to Christine Riordan, who is going to be speaking on her paper, Theorizing Market-Driven Occupational Change in the Professions. She recently joined the School of Labor and Employment Relations at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, where she teaches collective bargaining and industrial relations. Her most recent research focuses on voice and conflict in the employment relationship.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to bring up my slides really quick. There we go, hopefully. So thank you. My name is Christine Riordan. I'm at the School of Labor and Employment Relations at UIUC. And I'm going to talk to you about some work considering how different work arrangements like gig work are affecting occupational change. I'll try to do it very quickly so that we can reconvene for some questions and comments at the end. Two quick notes, this is not as tied to gig work as some of the other papers. I was originally in a different session, but hopefully you will see some connections. And I'm also presenting to you today a snippet of a review theoretical paper. I've done qualitative work and survey analysis on different parts of this story, which I'm happy to talk about at some point. But this is really trying to just really think about how we situate different work arrangements like gig work or featured work more generally within occupations. And so the question I've been really thinking about is how the competitive environment of firms, market dynamics, in other words, affect and shape occupational change in sectors and occupations where we see these different work arrangements emerging. And so in particular, I've been thinking about this in the realm of the legal profession, specifically in the corporate law sector, which consists of large law firms that serve corporations, sometimes referred to as big law. In big law, particularly during and after the financial crisis, we saw an increase in the use of alternative arrangements from organizations that automate legal work to others that supply temporary staffing, various kinds of outsourcing. And more recently, we've seen a number of gig arrangements through which lawyers are completing one-off projects or tasks via online platforms. And I'll come back to this point later, but generally speaking, these types of organizations, these outsourcers, temporary staffing firms, and the like, which often incorporate technology and some form of automation into their work, are generally referred to as alternative legal service suppliers, or ALSPs. ALSPs as a segment of the legal industry have grown. Between 2016 and 2019, the sector had an annual growth rate of revenues based of nearly 13%. It far overshot many industry projections of where the segment would be. As you can see in this slide, the growth in ALSPs is due not only to demand an increased use by law firms, which you can see in red for the year 2019, but also by corporations' in-house legal departments, which we see in blue. And the latter of which have actually been the stronger driver of growth in terms of actual spending and willingness to use ALSPs between the two. And so while these organizations generally in the beginning took on kind of lower skill, high volume tasks, if you're familiar with legal work, this is stuff like document review. In recent years, they've moved up the value chain, increasingly taking on higher skilled tasks. And there's evidence, increasingly so, that these alternative providers are taking on work that in the past used to reside with law firms or the corporation's in-house legal departments. And so as we can see here, this has been captured by industry analysts in a number of ways. There's not terribly reliable data on this sector, but we see kind of flattened demand since the financial crisis. And this was following years of annual growth leading up to 2008. And we see this in a number of other ways as well, that demand for law firm services and law firm work, it's flattening. Profits per partner, revenues per partner, all these other economic performance metrics of law firms have kind of took a dip during the financial crisis and have not returned to where they used to be. And so the question this raises is how these new competitors and this kind of redistribution of legal work as they take on more of this work that used to be allocated to one set of firms is changing the occupational pathways of lawyers. So you may be familiar when you think about kind of the occupational pathway of lawyers, and in this sector in particular, we often think about the traditional law firm. The law firm as a pyramid, right, in which entry-level lawyers are brought up into the firm and either move up to partner or over time move out of the firm. And since the 1980s and 90s, this model has really undergone change as ladders within the firms have become longer, with more steps, with different tracks to permanent, non-partner, and very specialized positions. And as these trends have continued, and as we've seen the growth of these alternative providers, some scholars have argued that what we're seeing is kind of essentially the law firm becoming a diamond, in essence, as more and more of the work, particularly at the bottom of that hierarchy, is pushed out to different sources of less expensive labor, which include these third-party alternative suppliers, and among law firms, a small but growing number of captive ALSPs, or kind of the firm's equivalent of these organizations in order to compete with these third parties. So one last thing I'll mention about this is that traditionally, law firms in this sector have drawn heavily, although not exclusively, from elite law schools, from top tier law schools when hiring their associate ranks. And so these alternative providers, both the third party and captive organizations, are increasingly drawing from a broader range of law schools outside of this top tier. So we see at the same time, we have these competitors, the market share is changing, the distribution of work is changing, reshaping ladders within firms, and it's also causing a reshuffling of the labor pool that we, as typically has been, kind of able to acquire this type of work in the past. So since in the kind of following the financial crisis period, there was a lot of debate about whether this kind of like dip in demand and these use in these alternative organizations were just temporary fixes to the financial crisis, but increasingly we're seeing that it's not the case. And so lately there have been lots of questions, not only in the sector itself, but also among legal scholars, trying to kind of figure out how to understand these changes. And there's been a number of arguments, theoretical arguments that have been applied to the legal sector. These include kind of traditional theories of occupational change, really that this is just about kind of competition over work tasks. Others are theorizing that, well, partners are trying to protect their access to power and to profits at the top, and so they're kind of reshuffling things within the firm in order to hold on to their position. Others cite the role of automation and say this is all about de-skilling, right? We're just taking work tasks and breaking them up into component parts, and they're becoming more routine and less skillful in the process. And the kind of argument I make in this paper is that we're not really capturing the full story with some of these explanations, right? We're unable to grasp, if we think about just competition, what's the overall direction of change within the occupation, within this particular segment of the occupation. De-skilling doesn't fully capture what's happening. I would argue it's less about de-skilling and more about redistribution and increased fragmentation, right? We now have more organizations performing the same tasks that used to just be held within the law firm and the corporate client. So 2 more slides, and so then we can move on to a discussion. So this alternative explanation is that market dynamics rooted in the relationship between law firms and their clients, combined with the organization of the market itself, is what is underpinning change. And so we have this vast scholarship on the study of law and the study of the legal profession, and we know from this scholarship that clients are determinants in many ways of law firms' organization and their related business models. So we've seen, for example, clients have increasingly relied on law firms for specialized knowledge as their own internal legal departments have become more sophisticated. And this is why one of the dynamics underpinning the appearance of those permanent non-partner positions, the elongated ladder that I showed you in the previous slide. We also know that this is changing the nature of firm-client relationships. They are essentially becoming more tenuous as competition has intensified. And in the past, law firms have responded by looking for ways in which they could bolster key economic performance metrics like the amounts of profits per partner, for example, by drastically increasing their entry-level ranks of associates and raising the hourly rates they charge for that entry-level work. And so these changes have been resulted in the long term over some very unstable business models, the problems of which became very apparent during the financial crisis, but were actually well underway before that point. And this is what has spurred the use of these alternative providers and was underlying the restructuring of this particular segment of the profession, and thus the traditional occupational pathways for lawyers in this sector. And so just on a final note, we can pair these kind of dynamics around client-firm relationships in the market with an analysis of the type of work that is actually being restructured and redistributed to unpack what those changes mean for occupational trajectories. And that is what the other empirical work that I've been doing in the field and what this survey has done, is to kind of take a look at the types of tasks that are commonly assigned to OSPs, not only their skill content, but how they relate to other things that we know are so crucial for our occupational progression. Things like being able to demonstrate autonomy, build social capital, the status, how value tasks are. All of these things combined, which used to be housed within a single organization, are now being split apart and allocated to very different sources of labor. And so if you have more routine kind of high volume work with certain characteristics going to some sources versus the kind of higher status, more elite tasks or value tasks staying within firms, we may see a kind of stratification of these two, of firms coming from this one powerful dynamic between firms and their clients. Gig work in law, I think in certain practice areas and with small and mid-sized firms, as it becomes more pronounced, we may see similar patterns. And so there's a clear connection here on that note, but I'm going to end so that we can have some more discussion for a few minutes.
Great, thank you very much. We do have a couple of questions in the chat, and I'll turn to those. If you do want to ask a question of any of the presenters, please just do a quick note in the chat, and then I'll turn it over to you if you'd like, or I'll read the question. So Christine, as an attorney who used to practice, there's a number of things I was wondering about. One is the billable rates, or versus profitability. And I know that a lot of business clients have complained about the high billable rates for these new young associates. And then just also about the growth of the mega firms. Is this economies of scale because the firms have grown so large? Or has that trend moderated and we're not having these agglomerations of very large mega firms?
Those are great questions. On the firm size, and there was a period in which there were mergers and acquisitions were really reorganizing firms and were kind of driving up growth of big law. But I think those have been paired with kind of these same things that you noted earlier about kind of billable hour rates and structuring their staff in order to leverage lower level attorneys at the highest rates possible. That has kind of undermined the kind of viability in some of that model. And we're seeing that not only in the US, but also in the UK and in other places where firms have expanded. And a lot of the outsourcing organizations that they use have also expanded into these other markets. And so it's a trend that has been happening, I think, at different geographies of the firm. And that we've seen repeating and intensifying in different places. I'm afraid I forgot your first question, and I'm also looking at the chat.
I was throwing a lot at you, about whether billable rates are going up, and I imagine you can't find the information on profitability of these firms. Many of them are privately held.
Some of their rankings in the industry, there's suggestion that within the top 100 firms, the AmLaw 100 as they're ranked, that there's a small group of like 10 to 20 at the very top, what are called the super elites, who can raise their rates and continue on these trajectories because they have such a strong reputation and relationship with their clients. But this is exactly the mechanism that's been driving the growth in these use of third parties. And there's been some recent industry surveys that show that clients are actually demanding law firms in their agreements with them that they use these alternative suppliers and not use kind of entry-level first-year associates, which right now it's something like between $500 and $600 an hour. So definitely related.
Great, so there's a couple of questions in the chat for you. And then I want to open it up and see if we have questions for the other presenters. And we're gonna go late since this is the final session on this stream. And then the general membership meeting is at 4:15. So we'll try to go at least 10 minutes over. So Christine, as you see this question about the fissured workplace, David Weil's work, and then Heather's question.
So the fissured workplace, this definitely fits in with that, with David Weil's terminology around the fissured workplace, kind of separating out different competencies of firms and then the implications that has for job quality and all of these other things. It's definitely part of the pattern. And what's been interesting in law is that we've, kind of outsourcing and temporary work, some of those arrangements have been around for a while, but they are really entering the professions, kind of accounting, law, some of these other sectors where they have not been as dominant in a way, particularly I would argue post-financial crisis, that has been a little bit accelerated. And so we're seeing the spread of those arrangements into areas which typically have not seen them in the past. This other question about the rise of technology, the do-it-yourself legal document websites, drive fissuring in law firms. It's interesting in the corporate legal sector, some of those do-it-yourself websites haven't really haven't really touched the corporate sector because they tend to be focused in practice areas of smaller and mid-sized firms. If you think of like personal family law, small business stuff, they tend to be a little bit separate, although in the corporate realm, technology around automation, e-discovery, some of these other things are definitely part of the agenda of these alternative suppliers, which has driven in a lot of ways demand around alternative structures for getting that work done.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Do we have questions for any of the other presenters? So for Chi Wang, I just had a question about the legal status of these drivers on these platforms. Is that well established now, or are they operating in a legal gray zone still?
Oh, they didn't make it clear that whether it is an employee yet, and the drivers now did not sign in labor contract with the either the current firm or the platform firm. So it's still like work as a gig workers, you know, but they are organized in a quasi-formal way because some of the part of the workers are committed with related to working time to the platform firm, but they did not got did not got the salaries and sorry, did not got the salaries and the low.
It's okay, take your time.
So let me, I mean, their legal status in China is not clear, and scholars are still quite controversial, are discussing about that. But in practice, most of the workers, because they're doing informal work for a long time, and they treat the red hailing work as a pretty good job, and they spend almost they work full time on the platform firm, but they did not get some basic salaries and the social welfare. Yeah, that's my answer.
So it relates to David Weil's research on the fissured workplace. You have the question of whether they are employees or whether they're self-employed.
They are not employees in the legal status, but they are treated and they are organized as the employee. But they did not get the basic salary and they are not enrolled in the social welfare system yet. So, did I answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Do we have other questions or Ben or Sam's paper, or do either of you want to comment and add anything that may have been missed?
I had a quick question for Sam. I was wondering if you could, do you know the kind of sectors or industries that the different firms that you were looking at, where they reside?
Oh, actually, it includes all different kinds of industries.
Sorry, Sam, your answer is a little bit mixed up on the audio.
Okay, so it includes all different kinds of industry, basically. And they are not very different in terms of using contingent workers.
So Ben, was there anything that you wanted to expand upon on your findings?
Not anything that needs to be expanded on so thoroughly. Realistically, the next steps for kind of the research is trying to identify whether or not it's full-time or part-time or that kind of like secondary employment mechanism. But if there aren't any questions, then I'm good.
Well, I'm wondering about the impact of COVID-19 and, on health insurance and the self-employed and what's going to be happening in terms of national policy. I see a lot of movement in this area coming along.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of movement in the area, in particular because we have kind of this push. I don't know if anyone kind of followed the previous session on kind of the federalism of job work and of kind of classifications of employees in this type of non-standard work arrangement. But the idea that in this COVID pandemic, a lot of different firms and workers are realizing what they actually are classified as, which is something that actually many people don't think that they actually know what the real classification structure is. So they went to apply for different types of benefits or supports for paid sick leave or unemployment insurance. They kind of got met by this fissuring of the workplace. They realized that they don't have access to those benefits. And so I think that there is definitely going to be movement in the idea of who gets access to what federal policies like Medicaid in kind of the coming months and years.
And as we've seen on the COVID-19 and world of work, is there are great disparities around the world in countries and between groups of workers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our papers on COVID-19 in Korea talked about how healthcare is universal in Korea, no matter what your citizenship, immigration status is, but only citizens have access to the stimulus package money.
Mm-hmm.
There's a great varieties of packages and responses around the world that are extremely uneven.
Yeah, certainly.
Great. Do we have any final notes by any of the presenters? Great. Well, I think we could wrap it up. And I hope everybody will join in the membership meeting.
Was that another question? I thought someone just raised their hand in the participants.
I didn't see the hand raising. Oh, I see. Ting Ting, do you want to go ahead and pose your question?
Okay. Yes. When Ben was talking about the Medicaid and self-employment, I'm kind of wondering, what is your observation of what type of self-employment? You mentioned as part of your future analysis, but as of now, what's your basic kind of underlying assumption, or what's your minor observation? Because if it's Medicaid expansion affecting those self-employed, so those should be a very unique type of self-employment. So yeah, kind of what sector, what kind of demographic, so just curiosity on that.
Yeah, so demographic-wise, we know that the people most likely impacted by the Medicaid expansion are single adults, and primarily those single adults are most likely, since it's a self-employment aspect, male, given demographics information from the CPS and ACS. So what we're probably seeing is single male adults in kind of the 20 to 50 age range being less likely to take up secondary sources of self-employment. So this could be for a range of different reasons and across a range of different industries, but what is most likely happening are kind of those periphery industries that people are kind of quicker to pick up or drop. So things like contracting work, where we have a lower threshold for being included in tax documents, in construction or food services and accommodation, which are also potentially one of the reasons why I was interested in the effect with online gig economy, in that those are some of the industries that are also being picked up by things like TaskRabbit, Uber, Airbnb, Upwork, that type. So one of the hopes in expanding this analysis is including an industry level analysis, because I get NAICS industry codes with the actual data, so I can see how the effect might vary in both size and direction across industries. Does that answer the question a little bit?
Yes. Thank you. I look forward to your further analysis on this. Thank you.
Yeah, so do I.
Great. On that happy note, I don't see any other hands raised.
Can I say a little more about your question?
Yes, go ahead. We've got another minute or two.
Oh, yeah. I want to explain that for the gig work in China, we have a lot of full-timers on the gig work platform, but they are not signed a legal employment contract with the firm, and not covered by the minimum wage and social welfare system. And we also can see for workers who signed a legal contract with the firm, I mean, in the other industries, their working relations is still pretty bad. So I'm thinking about that in China, maybe the legal status, I mean, whether you signed an employment contract with your employer. It's not that important. It's related to the working conditions. Yeah.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that clarification, and thank you all for your presentations. And I'm glad we had time for a good discussion afterwards. So I wish you the best. I look forward to reading the final versions of the papers. And for those of you who are members, I hope that you'll be able to join the membership meeting, which starts in 5 minutes. I will thank you all.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.